tela ou papel? Tinta ou pixel? Robert Darnton, considerado um dos maiores historiadores americanos, vive num dilema. Ele é amante do papel, mas trabalha para digitalizar o maior acervo de livros do mundo. Ele é diretor executivo da Biblioteca de Harvard, que tem 100 unidades e cerca de 17 milhões de obras. Professor e pesquisador, Darnton também foi repórter e trabalhou no New York Times. Especialista na França do século XVIII, é autor de obras como O Grande Massacre de Gatos e A Questão dos Livros. No Roda Viva de hoje, falará de história, de tecnologia e do futuro do conhecimento na era do Google. Boa noite, o Roda Viva de hoje traz na sua bancada os entrevistadores convidados, professora Beatriz Kuchnir, que é doutora em História pela Unicamp e diretora do Arquivo Geral da cidade do Rio de Janeiro, Lília Schwartz, historiadora e professora de Antropologia da USP, autora de As Barbas do Imperador, Paulo Werneck, editor do Caderno Ilustríssima da Folha de São Paulo, Wilson Moedawi, que é diretor editorial da revista Informática Hoje, Cassiano Elec Machado, jornalista e editor, além do nosso cartunista Paulo Caruso. Esse programa foi gravado para depois pôr as legendas e, portanto, não temos como responder as perguntas da plateia virtual. Boa noite, professor Robert Darnton, é uma honra tê-lo aqui. E o senhor é especialista, além de história, um dos grandes historiadores americanos, o senhor é especialista em digitalização, livros, história do livro. Como é que o senhor compararia a situação que nós estamos vivendo hoje, de passagem para o meio digital, com a experiência histórica? A invenção da escrita, a invenção dos tipos móveis, do Gutenberg. Que momento nós estamos vivendo?
It's a big question, but I'm honored to be able to try to answer it. You know, I think we are living through a period of technological change as great as in the era of Gutenberg. And if you want to go farther back, you could say there are not many great turning points. 4000 BC, the invention of writing. 1000 BC, the invention of the alphabet. Around the time of Jesus Christ, the invention of the Codex, a book whose pages you turn instead of rolling. Then Gutenberg in the 1450s. Things are speeding up. 1974, the internet. 1991, the World Wide Web. In the 1990s, you have special Google-type search with relevance ranking, social networking. It gets faster and faster. And I think people today are quite puzzled as to where we are going. We're trying to see into the digital future, and I think we all have the sensation of living through a time driven by technological change, but I think there's more to it than technology.
O senhor acha que está se democratizando mais o conhecimento com essa digitalização ou não?
Well, potentially, yes. So I see two forces at work. This is oversimplifying, but I think that the democratization of access to knowledge is spectacular. Will it actually happen? We don't know. Potentially, the internet has the power to open up the world of knowledge to the whole world, everyone who has access to the internet. But the other force, which I call commercialization, I think is very dangerous, because it could be that commercial companies whose main business is not access to knowledge but making money, that's their nature, they could monopolize this new world of, if you like, technological access to knowledge. And so we have forces at work. I don't mean to simplify too much, but I think it's crucial right now for Brazil, for the United States, for everyone, to make sure that the public good is served first, and that it's not just a matter of making money.
O senhor está desculpa, mas o senhor está se referindo claramente, não explicitamente, ao Google. O senhor já demonstrou uma preocupação repetidas vezes com um provável, possível monopólio da disseminação do conhecimento pelo Google, que hoje é o oráculo do mundo moderno. Esse é o perigo a que o senhor se refere. Quer dizer, ao mesmo tempo em que uma única entidade promove a disseminação ampla para todo o globo de informação e de conhecimento, ao mesmo tempo tem interesses comerciais e isso pode ser um risco para a disseminação do conhecimento. É isso?
Well, yes, in short, but in many ways I admire Google. I know the Googlers. I've actually negotiated with them. I've met with them. You know, they're all younger than 30 years old. You go into their office, they don't sit on chairs like this. They sit on inflated balls that are colored yellow and red and green. And they have free food everywhere. And they're very intelligent and tough lawyers. So I admire their technology, their chutzpah, their ambition, and I think they are dangerous. Why? Well, they're a company, and their natural business is to make money for their shareholders. So that's normal. There's nothing evil in it, although, as you know, Google's motto is, do not be evil. So why is it that I feel a danger? Well, Google decided to digitize all the books in the research libraries of the United States. They came first to Harvard, and we said, yes, we will let you digitize our books free of charge, but only books in the public domain. Then Google went to the University of Michigan, Stanford, California, and these other universities permitted Google to digitize all of their books. So instantly, you got a legal battle over copyright. Now, the story gets complicated at this point, but as soon as the legal suit began, Google started secret negotiations with the Authors Guild, the Association of American Publishers. For 3.5 years, they fought over what they called a settlement. And this settlement transformed what originally was a search service. So you, the viewer, could go to Google and punch in a word, and you would see in what book that word appeared with snippets, short extracts. And then Google would even tell you in what library you could find the book. I thought this was terrific. However, the settlement transformed that search service into a commercial library. And the commercial library used all of these books, which we in research libraries let Google use for free, into a gigantic digital database, and then asked us to buy back access to our own books for a price that would be set by Google and that could escalate out of control. So the public was not consulted. There was no public monitoring of this. And I thought this was a danger of monopolization of access to knowledge.
E se não for o Google, o senhor já demonstrou também a preocupação legítima de que se um dia o Google desaparecer, quem é que vai cuidar de todo esse acervo de obras digitalizadas ao longo do tempo? Mas se não for o Google, quem é que o senhor acha, que entidade o senhor acha que pode assumir esse papel? Uma entidade supranacional como a ONU, a Unesco, por exemplo, deveria iniciar uma campanha para assumir a responsabilidade sobre a digitalização de todo esse acervo?
Posso completar?
Claro.
Na sua reflexão sobre a história da questão dos livros, o senhor aponta de que, de uma certa maneira, a academia falhou, que nós poderíamos ter iniciado esse processo de digitalização e acabamos entregando isso a um poder privado, né? Por que às vezes é tão difícil para a academia, para a universidade, trabalhar em rede? né? Às vezes, numa mesma cidade, várias instituições compram o mesmo maquinário, podendo se associar. Quer dizer, nós falhamos, então o Google só tomou esse espaço porque nós falhamos. E como lidar com isso, né?
Well, two very good questions, and I agree. We should have taken the initiative. We should have been first. But maybe we were too timid or too conservative. Google has no timidity at all. They plunge ahead. So they, in a way, showed the possibility of someone else doing it. Now, I should explain that this settlement, which I described, had to go before a court. And the Federal District Court in New York said, no, it's illegal. It's a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. So to get back to your question, I'll begin at the beginning. On October 1st, 2010, I invited to Harvard representatives of the great private foundations in the U.S., leaders of libraries, and computer scientists. We had a day and a half of discussion, and I sent them a one-page description of a possible digital public library that would be free. Within a half an hour of the beginning of this debate, they said, we'll do it, it's a good idea, and we will provide the money. So we will create a coalition of foundations, not the government, but private foundations, to come up with the money to do the digitizing, and we in the research libraries will provide the books. Now that sounds simple. In fact, it's very complicated. We've been working at it for 2 years, but we will create, I hope, the greatest library that ever existed, not just for the US, but for Brazil and the whole world. It will be, we call it, Digital Public Library of America, and we are going to get it up and running next April, April 2013, in a preliminary form, but we will begin something like your public television here. It will be a public library, all of it digital, and we will, so to speak, share the intellectual wealth of our great libraries, such as Harvard's, which is the largest university library in the world, 17 million volumes. We will digitize them and make them available free of charge to everyone. Now that may sound utopian, and in a way it was the utopian dream of the philosophers of the 18th century, but they did not have the internet. They had the printing press in a largely illiterate society. We have the internet. We can make it happen, and we will make it happen.
Professor Rob,
A Lili
você
vai
está
fazer uma
falando
pergunta.
de uma espécie de república das letras, mas nesse caso virtual, não é? A minha dúvida eu acho que é a pergunta que não quer calar, porque nos seus livros parece que o senhor não tem medo da morte, né? As ideias não morrem, os filósofos morrem, mas as ideias ficam, as bibliotecas não morrem, mas os livros podem morrer. Então, na sua opinião, essa pergunta de todos, né? Os livros vão morrer? Ou seja, estou vendo essa república virtual. E os livros, né? Como é que ficam? O senhor tem um Kindle, um iPad, por exemplo?
I read books on paper. I prefer printed books of the old-fashioned kind, but I'm a great believer in the digital future. And even the digital present, because we're already in the digital world. But I think people oversimplify when they say it's either digital or analog. People love to dramatize, and it sounds dramatic, you know. We live in the information age, as if other ages had no information. Of course they had information. It traveled by different means, by graffiti and street songs and pamphlets and printed books. But when you say the book is dead, I disagree. I think the book is more alive than ever. And we can prove it because we have statistics. I believe in Brazil, publishing is flourishing, publishing of the traditional printed book. China has doubled its book production in 10 years. In England, old-fashioned England, more books are published each year than ever. There was it was called the Spectacular Thursday for publishing. in which 800 books were published on the same day, on October 1st, 2011. For the first time now, more than 1 million new books in print, on paper, are being produced worldwide. So the curve goes up and up and up. Book production is doing very well, thank you. Now that may sound too optimistic. Of course, lots of people are having difficulties. Many publishers, especially booksellers, book chains are now having difficulties. And many people feel confused about the viability of business plans. So I'm not trying to oversimplify and say everything is great, but I am saying we can prove that people love the printed book. Now that does not exclude the digital book. So in my opinion, we are living through a period of transition, and that's why it's so interesting. Because everything is fluid, everything is changing, and therefore it's a moment of great possibility when, well, one possibility is to create a digital public library of America.
O senhor compra muitos livros digitais, professor, para a biblioteca de Harvard?
O senhor falou
O senhor compra muitos livros digitais para a biblioteca de... Qual é a proporção entre livros digitais e livros impressos? Desculpa, Cassiano, você já fala.
Well, we buy an enormous amount, not only of digital books, but of digital databases, and of course electronic journals. Now the exact proportion, I could almost give it to you in dollars, and I could be slightly wrong, but we spend about $40 million a year on acquisitions, and of them maybe $7 million for digital works. But many of those are digital academic journals. And that's another danger because, as you probably know, the publishers of these academic journals, which are crucial, especially in the hard sciences, put up the prices, up, 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 up. There has been an inflation of 400% in the price of learned journals since the mid-1980s, compared with the consumer price index, which has only gone up 70%. So publishers realize that they can make a fortune by exploiting the demand for scientific knowledge. And this is hurting libraries terribly. So yes, we buy at Harvard an enormous amount of digital material. It costs too much. And we have to do something to stop the inflation of digital learning. So that's another example of commercialization, because they control access to books. There are 3 publishers that control 42% of all scientific articles. And they make a lot of money, a huge amount of money. I'm not afraid to say it. If you take Elsevier, in the year 2010, they made £2 billion sterling in England. And their profit was 36% of £2 billion. Now that's a rather large profit margin. How can they do it? Well, they have us by the neck in academic libraries. We must buy their journals because our researchers say this is our access to knowledge. So we have to find a way to fight back. And that's why I say the danger of commercialization could outweigh the danger of democratization. It's a very, very great problem. And it's a paradox, because when you think of it, we, the academics, do the research. We write the articles. We referee the articles. We serve on the editorial boards, all of it for free, and then we buy back the product of our own labor at outrageous prices. So the basic economics of academic publishing is crazy. That's another thing we must stop, in my opinion.
Professor, por favor, aqui no Brasil essa mesma questão está acontecendo em relação à digitalização por parte de estudantes que estão formando redes de digitalização de livros para democratizar o acesso aos textos ao ver desses estudantes, que é proibitivo pelo custo e por questões de distribuição. O senhor colocou agora há pouco a exploração comercial do Google como um problema central na sua crítica a essa digitalização. O senhor acredita num trabalho colaborativo, que não vise o lucro, mas que vise a constituição de acervos de livros digitais? Por exemplo, na América Latina, na Argentina, já existem grandes sites de livros de humanas, de humanidades, que são compartilhados por estudantes sem fins lucrativos. O senhor acredita nisso?
Well, I do believe in this, but I'm also trying to be realistic. So I may sound utopian. You know, a college professor lives in the 18th century, loves the great philosophers of the Enlightenment, and dreams dreams. I want to fight that tendency by saying we should be realistic, we must have business plans, we must cover our costs. Of course, knowledge should be free, but it costs money to produce the knowledge. So there's a distinction between two kinds of freedom, what economists distinguish as free beer versus free speech. So, of course, we need cooperative arrangements of the kind you suggest. And we are doing this with our Digital Public Library of America. So we went to Europe, where there is Europeana, and that is an attempt to amalgamate different digitized databases in 27 European countries. We decided we would design our technological infrastructure to be compatible with Europeana. And that means that when we grow and grow as a library, we will do it with Europe, and we will have a transatlantic open source world of learning. Now, I hope that happens in Brazil, and that the same thing should be linked. It's very feasible. We have terrific technology, so I don't think this is utopian at all, and I applaud your students who are trying to get access to knowledge. But we have to respect copyright. So I'm not for a moment arguing that we should infringe copyright. That's a problem. If we want to make these books available, we must do so in a way that will respect the intellectual rights of the authors and the publishers. In the United States, every book up after 1923 is covered by copyright. And that means that almost the entire 20th century is off limits for an open access digital library. What are we going to do about it? You know, I think that's our greatest problem. It's a bigger problem than the technology, than the money, than the sources. And so we have a series of teams working on the legal problems to find a way to respect copyright and yet to make the books available. Not easy, but we must do it.
Agora nós vamos para um rápido intervalo no Roda Viva. Daqui a pouco a gente volta com o professor Robert Darnton. Roda Viva recebe o diretor executivo das bibliotecas de Harvard, Robert Darnton. Eu passo a palavra para o Cassiano Machado fazer uma pergunta.
Professor, você já salientou diversas vezes que cerca de 3/4 da produção de cinema pré-45, 3/4 da produção de cinema mudo, sumiu para sempre. A gente estava conversando aqui sobre estratégias de digitalização dos livros e você menciona os 17 milhões de exemplares da biblioteca de Harvard. Eu pergunto o que vocês estão fazendo para preservar as cerca de 676 milhões de páginas de website que existem hoje no ar, ou seja, como vocês estão se estruturando. Você mencionou rapidamente compra de bancos de dados, de bases de dados, mas eu queria saber como que vocês estão pensando a preservação dessa memória digital, até porque não existe nenhuma prova de que o digital sobreviva tanto tempo quanto o papel, né?
It's a very important question. So in planning the Digital Public Library of America, we are allocating 20% of costs for preservation. We're putting aside money to preserve digital texts, and also text not just of books, but of films, recordings, everything. However, you're right, no one has solved the problem of how to save digital texts. So what do? You know, the ones and the zeros that make up a digital text unravel. They come apart. And not only that, the software becomes obsolete, the hardware becomes obsolete, and worst of all, the metadata becomes obsolete. Now, most people, they say, metadata? What is that? It's your way of finding a text in cyberspace. So the text may be perfect, but if you can't find it, it's gone. At Harvard, we have an enormous area for preserving digital texts by migrating them from one format to another. And we have an electric eye that reads spinning digital texts and spots the unraveling of the ones and the zeros. We substitute formats. We keep them in 3 different places. We work very hard and spend a lot of money to preserve these texts. But it's a temporary solution. I'm waiting for some great scientist to come up with the answer. But while waiting, we have a responsibility to future generations to preserve these things. So, in the Digital Public Library of America, we will preserve the texts. And we are doing it at Harvard in a big way, and so are other great research libraries. But your question was also, what about websites?
Yeah.
Not easy. So we have developed a new program at Harvard to preserve and to create intercommunication of all the websites at Harvard. We have more than 1,000 websites. Every professor creates his own website and then collects data around it. They're very interesting. Their life expectancy is 44 days. I mean, worldwide, a website normally lasts 44 days. So websites come, they go, and yet they have very valuable material on them. Now, there is a kind of genius called Brewster Kahle. You may not have heard of him, but he went to MIT, he invented new technological breakthroughs, he made millions of dollars, and then he got tired of making money, and he decided he would preserve websites. He invented something called the Wayback Machine, and it takes photographs of all the websites, and he preserves it. That's the beginning of an answer. It's not the final answer, but I'm trying to say that we take seriously this problem in the U.S. We haven't solved it, but we're working on it.
E o senhor
Professor,
que
o senhor está
trabalhou...
falando em...
Só complementando.
Só para puxar para a história um pouquinho, que é porque o senhor está falando também em preservar, né, way back. O seu trabalho como historiador, eu queria fazer uma ligação entre o seu trabalho como historiador e agora o seu trabalho em Harvard, né? O seu trabalho como historiador, o senhor é conhecido como um dos introdutores dessa voga da história cultural, né? Na sua opinião e no seu trabalho com o passado, O senhor concorda com o jargão de que também a história é um passado distante, né? Mais ainda, piadas e gatos são bons para pensar, ou então a gente pode dizer que todo historiador é um bom fofoqueiro? Assim, nos seus livros.
Well, you know, Stendhal wrote in one of his notebooks, gossip is what historians should study. Gossip and anecdotes is where true history exists. So in one of my last book, well, actually my two last books, I did a study of gossip, of anecdotes, of stories as they floated through the air in Paris around 1750, 1789, through the French Revolution. I'm convinced that the means of communication 200, 300 years ago were crucial in history. And furthermore, we historians can discover those means of communication, especially in France, because the French had a modern police force. I love the French police. I don't like the American police quite as much, but the French police had special inspectors for literature. They kept track of all the writers they could find. And these files, manuscript files, I've studied. They found 500 authors in Paris around 1750. They included Montesquieu, Diderot, Rousseau, Voltaire, all the great writers, and next to them, hundreds and hundreds of writers that no one's ever heard of. But these people are producing pamphlets. They are going to cafes and gossiping. They're spreading information. And I think the spread of information is one of the most fascinating things we can do in history. So we can recreate actual communication circuits. And well, my last book, called Poetry and the Police, is a study based on police files in which they arrest a person for reciting in public a